Well, thank you all for joining us today. Many thanks to Meaghan and Gillian for joining us for this celebration as part of the World Creativity and Innovation Week and Day, the United Nations celebration of creativity and innovation around the world. We're so excited to have you with us, and thank you so much for devoting your time from your busy schedules. We know you're professors, and you released a book recently, the Cultivating Imagination in Leadership, and we're so excited to have you with us to tell us about your book because the United Nations International Day of Celebration is really about spotlighting our genius and creative talent around the world, and certainly here in Canada, that we feel is often, just working hard and kind of full of humility. And it's just great to have a chance really to celebrate. So thank you so much for having the time to spend some time with us today. And with that, I'd like to introduce Alexis Milligan to tell us a little bit more about today's format and conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis, and I want to just give a little bit of background about our organization and our connection with Gillian, and then we'll hear more about Gillian's connection with Meaghan. And we are on the steering committee of the Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity. And this has been initiated by representatives from Simon Fraser University, the University of Ottawa, and the Atlantic Centre for Creativity on the East Coast of Canada. And our goal is to unleash and promote the imagination and creativity across all field endeavors. So that's arts, sciences, businesses, education, anything you name it. We want to open up the doors to the conversations and what's happening in Canada in terms of imagination and creativity work. And we look to provide opportunities for people to connect, to share research, ideas, information, and just the news of new initiatives and inspiring people and projects that are happening all over Canada and now to the world. So without further ado, I would love to introduce my fellow steering committee member, Gillian Judson. And Gillian, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe we can hear a bit more about Meaghan, and then we'd love to dive in and talk about your new book. This is so exciting.
Yes, sure. I feel so fortunate and grateful to know people like you who are just so keen to uplift and accelerate and amplify imagination and creativity. So I know this isn't to talk about scenic, so I won't go down that road. But,
no.
I wanted to introduce myself a little bit. My name is Gillian Judson. I'm an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in the Educational Leadership Program. I'm coming to you from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo First Nations people, which is colonially known as Surrey outside of Vancouver. And we have a few minutes of sun, so I'm hoping to get a few rays here. And it's been my great pleasure to work on this project starting a few years back with my colleague, Dr. Meaghan Dougherty, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks. I just want to say I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having us. I'm Meaghan Dougherty. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Child and Youth Care at Douglas College. I'm currently at the college, so I'm joining as an uninvited guest on the stolen and ancestral lands of the Katzie, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, and Musqueam peoples. And with that, I'm honored to do work both in my teaching and my research that focuses on relationality. So I'm interested in relational ontologies, pedagogies, and methodologies, and how people kind of become in relation, and the power of imagination and building and kind of sustaining those generative relationships.
So see, wow, this is why I want to work with Meaghan.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say this is so exciting. I mean, and you just only introduced yourself. This is just so wonderful to have you in conversation with us here today. So again, on behalf of the World Creativity and Innovation Week, I would really like to thank you for dedicating some time in your no doubt busy schedules. I mean, so many questions come to mind, when we hear about your backgrounds and your exciting new book, The Cultivating Imagination and Leadership. And I wonder if we might really kind of start perhaps at a beginning, because I wonder, whether we might colloquially take imagination in some sense for granted, and one gets a sense that there's much more depth that you're really exploring here and revealing in your book. So maybe perhaps we could start really with just that kind of question, like, what is imagination? How do you perceive it? How do you enter into this topic?
So I could start with this one, I guess. I had the great fortune of doing my doctoral work under the guidance of Dr. Kieran Egan, the late Dr. Kieran Egan at Simon Fraser University, who was really a pioneer in amplifying, studying, and making very explicit how we can cultivate imagination in leadership. And in my many years of working as his student and then as his research assistant and then ultimately as his colleague, I've learned a lot about imagination, but I've always faced the misunderstandings that abound regarding imagination, and I know we all do in the field of creativity. So one of the things I've done recently, and this connects to my research area around ecological learning. I'm very interested in how we develop a sense of ecological understanding in the world and how we connect with the natural world. And so that might be from where my sort of metaphor for imagination comes, because I've realized over the years, one of the most powerful ways we can learn anything is to engage that imagination. So we need new metaphors for what imagination is and what imagination does. Because if you Google imagination, images of it, you get swirling colors, butterflies, fairies, and unicorns. And very few people see how that has to do with their role as an accountant or as a leader, a school principal, whatever it might be. And so we're really trying to encourage people to think of imagination in a very grounded way. Bring imagination down to earth and think about imagination as soil. So if you think about imagination as soil, soil is the fertile terrain out of which many things grow. It is the fertile terrain out of which we have creation, creativity, and innovation. The thing about thinking about imagination as soil is that it is universal. It supports us individually in the ways we understand ourselves and our own stories, but it connects us culturally with shared stories. This is all the work of imagination. It's also contextual, so the context you're in also can stifle or encourage imagination. And another aspect of that sort of metaphor and image for what imagination is that we can cultivate it. And this is a central part of our book and our work, is using specific tools to cultivate it. So with that image of imagination as soil, we'd like people to think about imagination as the capacity to envision the possible. And it's the sort of the rich terrain out of which all innovation and creativity grow. And so that would be my initial seed planting regarding what imagination is, hoping to increase its importance in a range of fields by thinking about it in that new or different way. Meaghan, would you add to that, change things? What would you do?
Just kind of to build off of that and highlight, I guess, my favorite aspect of what you've said is the envisioning of the possible. So for me, imagination really provides for new possibility. And imagination is that foundational aspect that allows us to think and feel and do things differently. So imagination is relational. It helps us empathize. It helps us connect. It helps us understand one another. And we are finding through the work that we're doing right now that in those processes of connecting and understanding, that also helps cultivate our imagination further. So it's this nice cyclical process that we're seeing between imagination and human connection. And like Gillian said, we see imagination as a very practical, not pie in the sky rainbows and unicorns, but a very practical and very necessary element in all of the things that we do. So in the classroom, in leadership, in terms of not only connecting and understanding, but also envisioning and figuring out who we are and where we want to go together in that process.
If I could say one more thing to add to what Meaghan said, is that if you're interested in imagination, there's a beautiful book that we only came across in the last few years by Julian, Pendleton, and Brown, and it's called The Pragmatic Imagination. And they say in the turbulent times in which we live in, the only way to navigate this river with white water, I think they refer to it as a white water rapid world, is with imagination. Because despite what people think, imagination is required in a whole range of cognitive activity, from perception, all that we don't typically consider to be imaginative, all the way through to that futures thinking and speculation. Imagination is involved in all of that because it connects the what we have and know across that little gap or large gap, depending on if we're speculating futures or if we're just envisioning a new way of dealing with a problem that faces us in our day. It's imagination that crosses that gap. So Julian, Pendleton, and Brown's book on the pragmatic imagination has been pretty influential for us in thinking about it.
So, okay, so in terms of looking at that's imagination, what about leadership? Again, the perceptions around what leadership is and how we have associations to that word, and how does that play out? And then how do these two things suddenly come together? Can you talk a bit about leadership and how you're looking at defining or redefining what that is?
I'm going to pass the
Sure.
baton to Meaghan. You start. Here's a baton.
I'll take the talking stick on this one, to start us off anyways. I guess it's important to specify that in our work, we approach leadership as being emergent and relational. So we look at relational leadership and leadership emerging within specific contexts and one's approach to that specific situation. So we don't necessarily equate leadership with management positions or what we would traditionally call like leadership roles. You may have a leadership role, and or you may also be engaging in leadership practices outside of a formalized role. So we kind of make that distinction and recognize that leaders emerge in contexts in relation to other people. So that's kind of our initial approach to leadership, pulling on the relational leadership theory. And we emphasize the importance of imagination in leadership because we see it as necessary in, like Gillian's saying, in terms of perception all the way to planning potential speculative futurities. We see it in all aspects of leadership as well. So we see that parallel in terms of being able to engage with other people, approach novel situations with humility and curiosity, taking risks, understanding various perspectives, understanding how people are making meaning of the situation, collaborating, true collaboration, envisioning new ideas, new directions. So we see imagination as kind of foundational in that emergent leadership, allowing leaders to really understand themselves and engage in this ongoing process of self-reflection, and also seek to understand others as they kind of go through that leadership process, rather than taking kind of a traditional kind of top-down managerial approach.
Totally.
Gillian, Judson.
Everything she said. And in addition to that, I think that we talk in leadership, there's a lot about the importance to humanize and to connect to others, but we're not seeing anybody go back and say, well, what are the tools to humanize? How do we empathize? And what are the tools we have? So back it up. Imagination contributes to empathy, which is necessary for humanizing leadership. So our research, we're hoping, is making a bit more practical and tangible the ways in which our imaginations work and the ways in which we can engage them. And also within the realm of relational leadership, there's a whole range. In leadership theory, historically, there's just sort of been this great man theory of that powerful leader in the front of a room, very top down. And I think that we can be quick to equate imagination with that sort of leader-centric view. A powerful leader possesses this imagination. And we want to push that a little bit, pushing into sort of the relational leadership, which says, well, actually leadership emerges between people in that in-between space. So how is that an imaginative space of possibility? How is imagination actually cultivated within and among people in communities, rather than being conceived of as a possession of the one? And I'm reminded of, I just came back from AERA this weekend. That's the American Educational Research Association. Had a bit of a fangirl moment because I was at a round table and I was sitting next to someone named George. And I didn't realize that I was sitting next to George Theoharis, and I've read a lot of his work on social justice leadership. And he talks about, without referring to imagination, he says we need arrogant humility as leaders. That means we need to come in and say, we can change this. We can make this better for our learners. And we all got to work together because we all got to do this together. We need help. We need to build on each other's strengths. So both is important for a leader. And I think that imagination is what enables a leader to sort of be embedded in a context where they can lift each other up and enable possibility. So that's how we see leadership. Thanks, Meaghan, for your description. And that's where we're seeing imagination come in as necessary.
Wow, this is just so exciting and so amazing, because I think we're feeling really inspired. Certainly I'm feeling quite inspired really by your invitation to expand this space. of considering what imagination might be and how it might interact with us in our lives, and in what ways it might serve to kind of amplify our agency. And I wonder if we might touch upon what you just mentioned there, this notion around social justice and imagination, because increasingly, I mean, you, I think, spoke very eloquently about leadership and how it might amplify leadership. And it's so interesting because increasingly we're invited to exercise leadership on a kind of global and planetary scale, to encounter, hopefully effectively, some of our exigent, challenges, the climate crisis, among others. And it's interesting that, these challenges are increasingly being framed as social justice issues. We're starting to understand that they are much bigger than just economic issues or just financial issues, or just they're in fact, you know, affecting many spheres. And the social justice element is increasingly seeming quite central. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about that role, how you perceive the role of imagination in the pursuit of social justice?
Mhm. Do you want me to start on this one, Meaghan? Okay.
Go for it.
Sure. So one of the things we have seen from our reading and research, empirical research, is that imagination, and specifically tools of imagination, can help us build equitable communities, in the sense that Dr. Ann Lopez's work talks about the necessary role of unlearning as part of leading in a way that supports decolonialism and social justice thinking. And so imagination helps us sort of crack open those really strong perceptions and belief systems that make us feel like something that is cultural is natural. And so one of the tools we can use for imagination is to crack that open. But we're realizing from our first round of research that somebody in our first round of study, we worked with some students that had been through a 2-year master's program in imaginative educational leadership. And one of them referred to imagination as offering everyone a place at the table. It's a space of possibility in which we can all come together. And then in working a little bit with that idea, we were asked by some colleagues of ours, well, does everybody really have the same place at the table? Whose imagination is really welcome there? And so the next phase of our research is looking more at positionality and how sexuality or gender or race and other aspects of identity actually impact how well one is safe enough, willing to think in ways that are different, talk about feeling and emotion in a realm that has typically ignored those dimensions. But when you talk about imagination, we can't not talk about feeling and emotion. So this next study will help us understand if, in fact, it is open and accessible to all to employ imagination. And if not, and I suspect very much not, then how do we support it being more accessible and possible for more people? My sense is we have to talk a lot more about imagination in leadership right now. And I was at, as I said yesterday, a conference. I asked these leaders, they're all at a table that was about innovation in leadership. And I said, what idea or feeling comes to mind when you think about imagination in your leadership? Scary, risky, right? And I said, exactly, because we don't talk about it. And my next question, what do you think imagination is? It's make-believe. It's imagining things. It's separate from the kind of grounded work that we're trying to do. So important, and barriers and challenges to overcome, I think. Meaghan, what would you add to that change or whatever?
That was lovely. And it's, for me, a really good question, a really important question. Like, that's what we're thinking on right now, is what is this relationship between imagination and social justice? And I think at this point, I'm not quite sure. And I really want to keep finding out about what that means. We know that imagination has this potentiality and allows us to envision things differently. So like Gillian's saying, we're existing in an increasingly complex context, right? Gordon, you mentioned the climate crisis as one example, coloniality. There's oppressive systems in place, and imagination potentially allows us to think beyond just reproducing the status quo and asking what else is possible. How do we open it up and not just kind of continue on with the same old reproduction? So it promotes the not yet. And in some cases, I think it promotes the not yet in terms of not even knowing where we're going. So we can envision different outcomes for ourselves. We're saying, okay, well, in terms of equitable practices, we don't have the outcomes we need. Let's imagine different outcomes. And also, like, we can see through imagination that new outcomes that we haven't even thought of yet are going to be kind of emerging through that process. So imagination, I think, is definitely necessary in a lot of elements that are integral to social justice, like understanding the experiences of others, or seeking to understand that experience, knowing that you'll never fully understand it. And trying to push beyond our own experience, again, like this opening up of our perspective, of our understanding. And I think, yeah, we're really interested in that, in terms of how can imagination play a role in kind of disrupting, or kind of going back to that soil metaphor. How can we look at imagination as a potential force for uprooting, or kind of excavating these systems, so we have space, we have kind of a more kind of fertile space, so that we can actually engage in new equitable practices. So we're hoping that we'll find out a little bit more, like Gillian was saying, in this current work, about what kinds of cultures cultivate imaginative leadership practices, what kind of relationships between the leader's positionality, or their identity, and their culture, their interactions in that culture, allow imagination to be enacted, to be received, to be engaged in kind of in a collaborative way. What's getting in the way of that? Where are the tensions? We know that the education system is quite sedimented and difficult to change, right? So how are those practices actually being introduced? How is imaginative practice being introduced, and how is it being received? And where is potentially the block there that we might be able to find out a little bit more about, in the hopes of then pursuing kind of more social justice outcomes in education.
Wow.
Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
continue. No, you can continue, Gillian.
Just a thought. Two of the chapters in the book, particularly the one by Zachary Thomas and James Kosherek, scholars that look at equity and how different identities tend to minoritize leaders. They talk about the important role of imagination in promoting equitable leadership, but also and equity in schools. But we also, I think, have to acknowledge the importance of eco-justice. And in their chapter, Dr. Sean Blenkinsop and Mark Fettis from Simon Fraser University, they say, how far are we going to get with the colonial conception of imagination itself? And so this has been fantastic for me. We're talking about, and we're not really questioning the notion that imagination is a human capacity. And they pick up the idea, the Haudenosaunee conception of imagination as a feature of the land itself. And for me, that's an example. It just blows my mind right open. So
Wow.
future work will need to look at Indigenous conceptions of imagination too, and try to understand both. So Alexis?
I think that the idea of that perception, and how do we perceive these words, and what are the influences that have formed those perceptions, and that the roots of that learning, right, that embedded learning, and that subconscious learning, just based on what I've been exposed to up to now within my sphere and my life, actually limits the possibility of understanding possibly even wider applications and implications of something like the engagement of my imagination. But how is that folded into a way of being, a way of living, a way of existence that we identified it as something separate, but in fact it's embedded in a light. This is how we actually live. This is actually just something embedded in the way we perceive the entire world. So that language shift, perception based, that's really, I think that's absolutely very innovative work to embark on. It's like, I think that's exactly it. It's interesting going back again to this great metaphor that you've talked about soil, and this word that you use in the title, cultivating. So if we're thinking about how to create a shift of thinking, a shift and use and application of imagination, these are tools, they are skills, they are practices, they are able to change, to create change. So how would we do it? How do we get better at this? How do we engage with it? How do we encounter it so it doesn't feel as scary. It doesn't feel as risky. It feels something that's possible, attainable, improvable. So what is that connection that we want to get there, but what do I have to do? What do I have to do to get there?
Mhm. I'm not sure. Do you want to start, Meaghan, or do you want me to start?
Sure. I actually want to pick up a little bit as well on what Alexis was saying in terms of kind of getting almost like boxed into our own experience and not being able to see things kind of beyond that. I think that's something that we're all struggling with and engaging in an ongoing process of kind of pushing beyond that. Like Gillian mentioned with our past piece on humanizing relational leadership, we were very happy with the idea that imagination potentially provided this space at the leadership table. And we were like, yeah, that's great, wonderful, right? And that was our privilege showing up in how we were seeing that. Sure, it's easy for us to say that imagination then offers this like space for diversity and equitable opportunity because we're not actually looking at some of those identity characteristics that are going to impact your ability to enact imagination in a productive way or to be seen as a good leader when you're trying to engage in imaginative practices. So part of, I think, doing this in our own practice is that we continually have to almost like check ourselves and kind of push beyond that closed in perspective of our own experience. And for me, like one of the ways that I do that is intentionally trying to engage in self-reflection, but primarily through like learning from other people. It's when we say to people, hey, like this is kind of how I'm making meaning of this. And they're like, cool, but what about this, this, and this? And you're like, okay, yes, like now this opens up new possibilities for me to start thinking about, to start looking at that I may not have been able to see myself. So for me, I think intentionally going in with that humility and that idea that I can be curious and engaged in learning, open to the experiences and ideas of other people. We heard a lot from our participants as well about this idea that traditional leaders need to know things. They have to have expertise. They need to know the answers. And unlearning that and saying, actually, ideally, you'd be going in and asking other people, well, what do you know about this? How can we collect this information together and create some new understanding that none of us are going to have independently, right? How can we create this wider idea about what's happening here? And I think that idea of unlearning is a really key piece, sitting in that ambiguity or uncertainty and being okay with not knowing, being okay with not being the expert, not having all of the answers. And that connects with what Gillian's saying about those leaders having some, for lack of a better word, anxiety about that, right? It takes some strength of spirit to be like, okay, yeah, like I'm okay. I don't know. I have no idea. And I'm okay with that. Let's figure it out together. That is a risky thing. That is a scary thing. So we can see why leaders who kind of, who potentially are enacting more traditional leadership roles think that that's a very kind of uneasy prospect for them to be thinking about. So I think doing it in our own practice, like Alexis was saying, it's how you engage in the world, how you walk the walk, or how you do things on a day-to-day basis in terms of being self-reflective and humble and learning and opening up to new ideas as much as you can in all aspects, not just professionally or in a school context, but in all aspects of your life.
I'm so grateful for Meaghan. I love working with Meaghan. The thing I would add to that is just around the notion of tool. So I did say that I began my doctoral work with Dr. Kieran Egan. And his pedagogical approach to learning is called imaginative education. It's a Vygotskian view of the world. And it's not just about school. It's about humans, how humans engage imaginatively in the world around them. And it's all based, Vygotsky called them psychological tools. Kieran Egan called them cognitive tools, tools that help us to think. Tools of the body. Alexis will know all about those tools. Tools of the body, tools of oral language, the story form, dramatic tensions, images, mysteries. These aren't just things. These are tools that have helped humans across millennia understand their world and lean into them because they engage imagination. Tools that come along with literacy, like bizarre and extreme things, humanizing meaning, sense of wonder, all kinds of tools come along with becoming literate, according to Kieran Egan's theory. And I think if you look around the world, you'll realize he's onto something. Philosophic imagination, understanding big ideas and general theories and anomalies. These are all practical cognitive tools, and you can probably see where the idea of soil worked really well, because it's like, well, we can cultivate soil with these tools. So in working with leaders, we want and need them to come in with the disposition that Meaghan's speaking of. Nothing's going to work if nothing will change if you're not willing to change and be open. But in that open space, let's introduce cognitive tools. How can you address this challenge in a way that highlights the tensions in it? That's a tool of imagination. How can you understand the mystery or the ambiguity in a topic to better understand the scope and nuance of a topic? That is a tool that uses imagination. So what we've done in the book is to, following each chapter, is to include an exercise that has us reflect back on the chapter content using a specific tool, cognitive tool. So my hope is that as we talk more about imagination in leadership, leaders can also begin to be more comfortable using these tools. They're additionally valuable because one of the things leaders need to do is be engaging to the people they talk about. I don't think it's just a BC thing that staff meetings can be pretty dry and boring, for example. But how are we communicating with the people around us in a way that makes our topics meaningful and memorable? We should be storytellers, not in the sense of going on and going off topic. Are we shaping the information about a particular policy in a way that evokes people's sense of its value? That is being a storyteller. Are we highlighting the human dimensions? So all of these things are practical tools we can use using imaginative education theory in the context of leadership. So that's the long answer.
Wow. Wow. Just so inspiring and so exciting. Thank you both for sharing this. It is just incredible. I mean, I appreciate so many things I think that you mentioned and talked about here. And I realize we could be really having like a half-day symposium or a full-day symposium actually on this. And maybe we ought to, because this is really just so relevant and wonderful. I mean, I'll just pick up on some of the themes that really stood out in my mind. One of them is this wonderful invitation that the two of you champion around the sort of the expansion of the notion of the self and the notion of identity. And, perhaps, moving a little bit, expanding, from as wonderful as the Enlightenment kind of was, and it enabled all these institutions that we're enjoying today and so on, it almost highlights a little bit of a kind of sense of limitation that we experienced in perceiving the self and identity as kind of part of the Enlightenment tradition, and kind of like moving towards more of, I guess, what we might have called the romantic sort of notions of the self that's more expanded and more full. And it really, as you say, connects, so wonderfully to what we now realize are the indigenous ways of knowing that seem to encompass, as you say, I mean, a much wider, broader notion of the self that we have an opportunity to learn from. And so it seems as if there are so many possible avenues for future scholarship and research. And you've mentioned some of your existing projects. What else do you think is relevant, and what kind of future research do you feel might be necessary or sort of beneficial for advancing this understanding of imagination in leadership and more broadly as well?
I know for me, I'm just with my roots in ecological thinking. I know there's people that say that our current ecological crises reflect a failure of imagination. And I think the opposite. It's a product of a very powerful industrial imagination. We've done a fantastic job of severing ourselves from the natural world around us. So what is required partly will be to cultivate an ecological imagination, an imagination that comes from the underlying understanding of human immersion in a living world. So that is an area that I will continue to be interested in. I know we're also want to pursue different topics related to positionality and social justice, but also leadership education itself. We think it's very important that the ways in which leaders are being prepared and trained not only employ cognitive tools and open up opportunities for imagination, but also allow leaders themselves to dig into how they are imaginative, the spaces in which they don't think they are, because they need to finish a program and become an acting leader in a way that where they're exemplifying and modeling that for the people they work with. So there's implications for leadership education for sure.
Yeah, I think your idea about the romantic self is a really interesting one. And I definitely think that to kind of pull back to that idea, there are issues with the Enlightenment self being very classed and gendered and raced. And so part of our interest in moving forward, I think, is looking more at, like Gillian saying, more of like a ecological self, or even like a more than human self. And we see that in the chapters, like Gillian mentioned, Mark Fettis and Sean Blankensop's chapter, and as well as Dr. Katie Strom's chapter in the book takes a more than human approach, looking at how the self is really co-constituted in a context and the agential force of various non-human agents in that context. So I think we're interested in kind of exploring. It's easy for us to kind of look at, like, how does identity impact your ability to enact imagination? But the reality is your context impacts your ability to enact imagination. We can't just say, like, oh, me as me, I can enact it the same way, regardless of the context I'm moving in and out of, right? There's this kind of co-constitutive force there. So we're interested in the cultural aspect and the person, the leader, and their identity within that cultural context to understand kind of how those things work together, interact to create possibility or to really limit possibility for imagination. So I think that's very interesting for me. And then, yeah, like Gillian saying, the next piece then is really around leadership education. So these ideas about imagination, what it is, what it potentially could do, not only in our own practice or in our schools, but beyond in our communities and in the society more generally. Like, we're interested in then how do we take those learnings and kind of build them into that educational process for future leaders. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if we didn't have to kind of ask leaders to open up and take risks and be vulnerable, but that was part of the process by which they became leaders?
So it actually gets like it's actually embedded in how we start to shift our thinking and shift our perceptions, and it's actually now a way of being. It's a way of moving forward in our okay, so it's incredible. We actually have like 45 minutes have blown by.
Wow.
So we have just a couple of minutes just to wrap up. Is there, like, what else should we know about this book? Like, when is it available, and where are we going to find it? What are some of the last, or like, what are some of the highlight moments for you, that for each of you, that have come out from this writing process to see it take this shape, this form? And is there anything that, if I'm going to go and pick this up and say, okay, what do I need to know about cultivating imagination and leadership? Here's the thing. Here's that little gem to take away.
I would love, I don't know if you can allow me to share my screen. I'd love to show a picture of the book. If I can't, I can just hold it up, but it's
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so there we are. We love it. Oops.
So the book is currently available. It's published through Teachers College Press.
Oh, sorry. This is terrible. There we go.
That looks good.
There we go.
So it can be ordered through the publisher. It's also available like on any kind of online services that you would normally get books through. I think for me, it's interesting because our process today, and I can't believe that 45 minutes have passed. I feel like we could keep talking about this for a lot longer. Our process today kind of also follows the process of the book. So we talk in the beginning chapters, the authors are really kind of pulling apart the conceptualization of imagination. And then we look at like very practical applications of imagination, and then move into kind of more what's the role of imagination in social justice. So our discussion today kind of nicely parallels how the book progresses. And I think it's just a wonderful group of authors with varied perspectives, really interesting ideas. We talk a bit about it in the introduction, that we see the book, again, kind of pulling from this metaphor, as like a collection of wildflowers. So you can see on the cover of the book, we have that image of the wildflowers, because every wildflower is kind of perfect and complete in and of itself, just like the chapters of the book, but together it creates something completely different, or more synergistic than just each individual flower. So we think, you could start at any point, you could jump back into those chapters that really resonate for you. We're hoping that it'll be kind of a iterative or processual engagement with the book.
We have some exciting opportunities to go deeper into the book coming up. We've got a, just to support the learning aspect, we see it as a very practically useful book for school leaders, whether you're in service or becoming a school leader. We have a webinar series starting next week, and it's 3 different sessions in which the authors of the book can really dig into their conceptions of imagination and notions of imagination. And Meaghan doesn't know this yet, but I met some people at that conference I mentioned that are scholars in social justice, and they seem super jazzed about imagination. So I think we should have a few more webinars in the fall in which we ask them to dig into their conceptions of imagination. And then the other piece is that we have, it's not just researchers in the book. We have invited, early on in the process, we invited leaders, practicing leaders themselves, to share stories of imagination. And so on the blog, which is called educationthatinspires.ca, educationthatinspires.ca, under the leadership section, there's a collection of leadership stories. And we're inviting, all in the book, we invite leaders throughout to say, submit your story, tell us how you're using imagination. So we're hoping, if it works out, to have a podcast in the fall where we invite the leaders that contribute stories to the actual paper book, that have contributed stories to the online collection, and that continue to do so, to discuss imagination. And I personally am inviting you, Goran and Alexis, to submit a story of how you use imagination in your leadership, because you do. I know you do. And so would love to showcase and share your story and have you part of the podcast in the fall. That would be fun.
Absolutely. It would be our absolute pleasure and an honor. Thank you for such a kind invitation. And certainly, I think, from the World Creativity and Innovation Weekend Day perspective, we would love to feature the podcast on our social media channels as well. And it's just so inspiring. I can't wait to read a book. On behalf of the World Creativity and Innovation Day and Week and the United Nations Day of Celebration, I really would like to thank you profusely for spending your time with us and sharing. And also, I would just like to briefly highlight an additional element of just one of the many wonderful elements in your work, I think, which is also the practical role of research scholarship, because you really are kind of connecting the dots for us, because not everyone has the time to kind of dive deeply to find things that work and to make them grounded, as you say. So I think it's just wonderful to see how scholarship is not just for the scholars, it's really for the rest of us and for the leaders, as you say. And with that, I'll just transfer to Alexis to also say something from the scenic perspective.
This is one of the great things about our Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity. It is just that opportunity to make these connections. And again, as you say, Goran, this is about not just having ideas and research like this locked into university environments or academic environments. This is about actually sharing tools that can create effective change. And we are in a landscape in the 21st century that needs this kind of work. It needs this research, but it needs it accessible. It needs it available. And I think this opportunity to talk to both of you in this way grounds the idea of all of these theories that could really get really conceptual and kind of a little bit complicated in anyone's mind. It gets it down to thinking about this as soil. And this is a practical tool that you dig, you plant a seed, and you see what grows. And it's just taking care of that. It's actually supporting it and just seeing what happens. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And Gillian, your connection. Now we have Meaghan part of this network and part of the work that we're doing with Scenic. And this has just been tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm super excited. And I look forward to getting your blog stories.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much, and congratulations on the book again. We'll be speaking soon, no doubt.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you both.